Look into this dark, unforgiving glass eye, the mesh of the microphone. Tell it your deepest thoughts, hopes, fears, and desires. We will take these emotions, turn them, and feed them back to you, for we have goals that your feelings will assist. This is how we rule, from the shadows, playing your emotions like puppet strings. We lead you to destinations that we have prepared, and you willingly oblige, thinking these decisions to be your own. When you do as we wish, we reward you, and when you go against us, we punish you. In a million subtle ways, we influence your supposedly free choice. By this method, we rule over a population convinced that they are the masters of their own destiny. Welcome to the Empire of Lies.
Yes, welcome indeed back to the Empire of Lies. I'm Yiz the Eunuch. This is Newsfist, aka Chris. We are bringing to you more content about particular things, people, stories, books, and models of psychological warfare, tools of mental and spiritual oppression and subversion. This is what this series is about. And tonight we have something very nice for you. Before I give it over to Chris, I would like to remind everyone that this stream always aims to be about an hour long. We have concise educational, informational content that we want to deliver. We will not be pausing to read paid chats, hyper chats on Odyssey, rants on Rumble, etc. We will review those at the end, however. So if there are things you would like to share, things you want to say about the topic, please get those in by about 45 to 50 minutes from now, and we will review those and respond to them at the end. As always, Entropy is the way I prefer to get paid messages. I like the good folks at Entropy. You can support us there. You can also support us these ways. You can send in short messages on PayPal and Cash App. You can also support me monthly on Subscribestar. Excuse me. Also, if you are a Subscribestar user, you can send tips in, which are like super chats. You can send over there. We already have one for the night. Also, you can help us out by just sharing the streams. The main way that you can help us grow and let this be a sustainable financial living for ourselves is to share these directly with friends and family, share them on social media, and get people involved with this educational series. I feel like it's a great one. I think that we're doing good work and adding useful, positive, constructive information to the Dissident Library. So if you could help us out, that would be great. And I see some familiar faces in the chat already. But for sake of time, since we have a lot to talk about tonight, let's go ahead and get rolling here. I don't think I have anything else to talk about. Oh, I cut myself, but that's a story for Monday because it's funny. So we'll be talking about that for Discordant Dragons next Monday night. Speaking of Discordant Dragons, we'll be back Monday with some familiar faces that you guys know. And Newsfist, is there anything you would like to talk about or shield before we get going tonight, sir?
Just check out my other stream, Happening TV, on Monday and Thursday night at 8 p.m. London time. Newsfist.net. It's all there.
All right. Well, then how about I pass it over to you, and you can explain to people exactly what it is that we'll be talking about tonight and why I chose the title for the stream tonight, Masks of Power, the Faultless God of Tyranny. Take it away, Chris.
So, perhaps some of you watching have wondered, what is power exactly? How is it defined? Well, if you were to go to university and do a political science degree, you would deal with this question quite a bit. And in the post-war era in America, there was a big argument about what exactly power was. Now, if you are living today and if you are familiar with the works of people like Whitney Webb, or you just have your eyes open, you would come to the conclusion that much power these days is in fact exercised through things like extortion, blackmail, threats, bribery. But this was not always the case in the United States, and indeed the rest of the West. And over the sort of intervening 50 years, since the 50s or 70 years, I guess, at this point, there was an argument that developed over what power was and how it was exercised. Around the 1960s, when the New Left became prominent, and I would just like to point out to anyone who is unaware of this, what we are living through now is essentially a replay of the 1960s, complete with the riots, the rise of the communists, Antifa, all of these kinds of things. This is basically the New Left part 2. And there was like a whole bunch of theory associated with this, which culminated in a guy called Stephen Lukes, who put forward the idea of the 4 faces of power. Now, let me just ensmallen, and I will stick up my first slide and get onto my reading. But first, a few quotes for you. What is power? According to Bertrand Russell, the production of intended effects. According to Max Weber, the probability that an actor can carry out his or her will despite resistance. Nikos Polantzos, the ways in which the system affects relations between various classes in conflict. This, of course, is the Marxist view. And this is sort of one of the ideas we will be exploring, how as Marxism progressively took over the West and took over Western academia in particular, the conceptions of power that they had became more and more Marxist. And then once these people got control, the way they exercised power was a deliberate reflection of the way they understood power to operate, which is one of the reasons why they are so terrible at ruling. It's also defined as who gets what, when, and the ability to make someone believe that your interests are their interests. This is the more sort of Marxian view. To briefly summarize, Luke's, the evolution of this idea, the first phase of power is to get someone to do something they otherwise wouldn't through, sort of brute coercion. This is sort of seen as the most obvious face of power. 2, shaping the agenda and preventing decisions from being made. This is Bachrach and Baratz, the 2 faces of power. 3, Luke's manipulating perceptions and interests. As you can see, this starts to get more fluffy and woke the further away you move from the first point. And 4, Foucault, the systems of social relations and practices or norms. So as you can see, it gets progressively more lefty as this goes on. This, as the US was being conquered by a new elite in the years after World War II, there was much discussion among political scientists about how power really worked. This thought regime on power that has now taken hold in Western academia started with a guy called Dahl back in the 50s, who analyzed the workings of New Haven, Connecticut, and determined that although it was a functioning democracy, the differences in access to material wealth and education meant that there were significant inequalities in democracy. This is Dahl, who governs democracy and power in an American city. This is an incredibly influential paper if you move in political science circles, and was sort of the seed of the Marxist or communist argument that you may have democracy, but unless everyone has equal access to the mechanisms of that democracy, by which, of course, they mean money, influence, access, then society cannot be truly equal. Remember, of course, back in the 50s, there was more sort of susceptibility to this argument that, we could make society a little bit more equal. We could help the poor more. We wouldn't have to have a communism. Look where we are now, ladies and gentlemen. Dahl ultimately comes to the conclusion that there is a professional political class that exercises influence over New Haven politics. This is an extension of the idea of politics as a vocation. That is, there are some people who are naturally suited to politics, and that no matter how a system starts, those people will gravitate to the maintenance and manipulation of political power for the interests that employ them. In other words, Dahl takes 351 pages to arrive at the conclusion that the managerial elite exists and exercises undue influence. He could have just read Pareto or Mosca, but he didn't. This came to be known as the pluralist view of power. Dahl specifically refutes the idea of a, quote, ruling elite in a later work in 1957 called A Critique of the Ruling Elite Model. A great many people seem to believe that they run things. The old families, the bankers, the city hall machine, or the party boss behind the scene. This kind of view evidently has a powerful and many-sided appeal. It is simple, compelling, dramatic, realistic. It gives one standing as an inside dopester. For individuals with a strong strain of frustrated idealism, it has just the right touch of hard-boiled cynicism. Finally, the hypothesis has one very great advantage over many alternative explanations. It can be cast in a form that makes it virtually impossible to disprove. This is the conspiracy theory argument sort of forming back in the 50s. Consider the last point for a moment. There is a type of quasi-metaphysical theory made up of what might be called an infinite regress of explanations. The ruling elite model can be interpreted in this way. If the overt leaders of a community do not appear to constitute a ruling elite, then the theory can be saved by arguing that behind the overt leaders, there is a set of covert leaders who do. If subsequent evidence shows that this covert group does not make a ruling elite, then the theory can be saved by arguing that behind the first covert group, there is another, and so on. Now, of course, you could very, very easily reverse this by saying that if there were a ruling elite, they would want to have a sort of screen to their power if they wish to rule covertly.
Just like how Academic Age came up with the octopus, just like Mencius Mollbug talks about the cathedral. That's the reverse of that, is there are many layers to the onion of power, and they only want us to interact with the outermost layer and stop there.
Except, of course, Moldbug believes that the cathedral is a blind force, not a directed force,
Right.
as opposed to, AA's
emergent behavior and all of that.
Emergent behavior, which I do not.
Which I certainly do not think is true. I
Yes.
believe that they actively and with malicious intent, many of them do what they do.
Now, remember, this is in 1957, when a new external elite was beginning to exert control over the US political system, while at the same time denying its existence, and you could be jailed for pointing out its existence. Unlike today, where its presence has become impossible to ignore, back in the 1950s, it was seen as a crackpot theory. Dahl's test for determining whether there really is a power elite is very interesting. Right, so this is his proposed test for is there actually a clandestine ruling elite? If tests like these are not valid, what can we properly require? Let us take the simplest possible situation. Assume that there have been some number, I will not say how many, of cases where there has been disagreement within the political system on key political choices. Assume further that the hypothetical ruling elite prefers one alternative and other actors in the system prefer the other alternatives. Excuse me. Then, unless it is true that in all or very nearly all of these cases, the alternative preferred by the ruling elite is the one actually adopted, the hypothesis that the system is dominated by a specified ruling elite is clearly false, right? So he's basically saying that unless you are in a situation where there is something that the polity very, very clearly wants, and they never, ever, ever get it, despite voting for it again and again, you can't say that there is a ruling elite. To sum up, the hypothesis of the existence of a ruling elite can be strictly tested only if, 1, the hypothetical ruling elite is a well-defined group on, say, religious or ethno-national grounds. 2, there is a fair sample of cases involving key political decisions in which the preferences of the hypothetical ruling elite run counter to those of any other likely group that might be suggested. And 3, in such cases, the preferences of the elite regularly or always prevail. Of course, immigration is the perfect way to test this hypothesis, and thus Dahl's test of the ruling elite is clearly satisfied. Despite widespread objection to mass immigration in many countries, key political decisions are always taken in the direction of more immigration. So back in the 1950s, it was not as obvious as it was now. Research, of course, has now come out. There is a very, very famous paper that analyzed the popularity of various decisions that were put before the US Congress and how likely they were to be adopted. And there was literally no relation between these two things at all. Dahl's view from the 50s, which is very much like the world that many boomers still believe that we live in, is known as the pluralist view. The pluralist view is the conclusion that few people exert direct influence on policy, but few cannot exert some indirect influence. So your voting is very important. Decisions over political appointments dominated by party leaders with little direct influence from economic and social notables. Decisions on education are dominated by the mayor and the board of education, but school administrators, teachers, and parents play an indirect role. Remember, he's talking about New Haven, Connecticut here specifically. Economic and social notables were involved in decision-making on urban planning, but the mayor provided the impetus for policy change. And he defines power as the ability of A to influence B to do something that B would not otherwise have done. This conception by Dahl led to accusations of a power elite and the development by Bachrach and Baratz of the idea of the, quote, second face of power. That power was not only about whether A can convince B to do something that B would not otherwise have done, but also about the ability of A to keep an issue off the political agenda, which is called the dynamics of non-decision making. This is also known as agenda setting. So you see this very, very clearly, for example, in the Speaker of the House in the US or the Speaker of the House of Commons. He is the person who decides whether a bill goes to the floor. If it's not, doesn't go to the floor, it doesn't get voted on.
We also see this in narrative craft of the last at least 30 or 40 years as well. Some could even say longer than that, but we see it with media and politics. Think of the phrase Overton window, the concept of what's allowed and what isn't allowed for discourse. Many things that regular people truly want, the end of mass migration, a return to a shared logos, a healthy ethnos, etc., have many warriors and champions for these causes that the media doesn't let you know about. They want you to think that the far right is Ben Shapiro. They want you to think the far right is Tommy Robinson and Carl Benjamin. Those are acceptable. Everything else, they just keep off the docket. Mainstream news is not going to tell you about Sam Malia being imprisoned for 2 years for stickers. They're not going to tell you about the thousands of us in the white well-being community doing solid work with counter-narrative propaganda. They're not going to tell you about the new white positive movements and groups building all across America that, whether Christian or otherwise, that are truly nationalistic in nature and are resisting the narrative's poison. That's not going to be on the news. And this is the same kind of thing Chris is talking about with political power. You don't let people like that even be allowed to vote. You don't let their ideas, you don't let their platforms and their candidates even be known to the public. It is lies of omission in a way.
Indeed, it is the unasked question, essentially. You do not ask the question because you do not really want to know the answer. For example, there is never going to be a referendum in the United States on whether they should abolish the Federal Reserve. It is just not going to happen. There, in my opinion, there will probably never be a referendum in the United Kingdom or whether they want to stop mass immigration. It is just not really a question. Now, occasionally, political powers will be forced into a situation where they must acknowledge a question that they have been ignoring. But that is a, force majeure kind of thing. And you can see many politicians assiduously avoiding the questions that they do not wish to be asked and they do not wish to answer. So Bachrach and Baratz came up with the idea of agenda setting that was later used to explain the idea that forces behind the scenes were preventing Marxist policies from being pushed in the United States. By making sure that Marxist alternatives were never presented to the voting public, it could be reasoned that this was the reason why they were not being voted for. So the second face of power, Bachrach and Baratz. Now, Bachrach and Baratz. Wait, hang on. Is this the one? Right. By the 1960s, there emerged a long-running disagreement between the elitists and the pluralists about who really ran the country. The elitists believed there was a power elite, while the pluralists at heart believed that no one was really running things, a conceptualization that would re-emerge in Curtis Yarvin's idea of politics as an emergent phenomena, or the cathedral as an emergent phenomena. To quote Bachrach and Baratz, against the elitist approach to power, several criticisms may and have been leveled. One has to do with its basic premise that in every human institution, there is an ordered system of power, a power structure, which is an integral part and the mirror image of the organization's stratification. This postulate to the pluralists, emphatically and to our mind correctly, they reject on the ground that nothing categorical can be assumed about power in any community. If anything, there seems to be an unspoken notion amongst pluralist researchers that at the bottom, nobody dominates in a town, so that their first question is not likely to be who runs this community, but rather, does anyone at all run this community? The first query is somewhat like, have you stopped beating your wife? In that virtually any response short of total unwillingness to answer will supply the researchers with a power elite along the lines supposed by the stratification theory. Now, I just want to point this out, that we are starting to see emergence of the idea of a secret elite. So you wouldn't look at a town and say, oh yes, the mayor runs things, and the guy who runs the canning factory, he runs things, and the head of the Masonic Lodge, he runs things, right? This begins to form into the idea of a secret power, right? As the US is taken more and more over by hidden forces, this argument begins to gain more traction. This argument was developed further by the explicitly Marxist Stephen Lukes, author of Power, A Radical View. Sorry, I don't have an image of the book, but you can look it up. It's very easy to find. He postulated the third face of power, which was power as domination, such that individuals follow the dictates of power even if it is against their best interests. He was very, very much a Gramscian, was Lukes. For Gramsci, power is exercised through consent rather than coercion alone. That consent is obtained essentially through deception and through commonality. People get used to power. There is sort of more of the sly coercion involved, more of the sort of psychological warfare. Lukes notes the tendency of dominant groups to articulate a social vision which claims to serve the interests of all and to which subordinate social groups give their consent. Now, he's talking about democracy, but since he's a commie, this is a massive self-report, because this is very much what communism was explicitly. When being taught this subject in university, the teachers are very careful to lean away from the idea that shadowy groups exert undue influence, because this might be seen as conspiratorial or possibly anti-Semitic, as well as anti-communist. So instead, the focus is put upon...
Those are synonyms, Chris.
Sorry?
I said those are synonyms.
So instead, the focus is put on, quote, systemic factors that are never really clearly defined, except in terms familiar to Gramscian hegemony, culture, morals, law, education, etc., which always boil down to one principle. It is these things that prevent progress towards socialism, which is simply taken at face value as an unalloyed good, yet never precisely defined in such terms, lest someone ask about the CCP, the USSR, or Cuba. This used to annoy me a great deal at university and led to some fiery exchanges with my teachers. This led to Lukes and the third face of power, which was convincing people that their interests were in fact your interests, which is simply a rehashing of the Marxist idea of false consciousness, which is what Marx used to explain back in the 19th century why people did not want Marxism despite it being in their own best interests. This is how he also explained why people did not want the revolution. They were filled with false consciousness. They were too happy with their gardens and their TV sets and, their middle class jobs. And this is one of the reasons why the Marxists hate the middle class over all other classes, possibly the working class if they will not rebel. But the middle class is seen as the anchor of stabilization that prevents the revolution, which is one of the reasons, for example, why Lenin attacked it so fiercely, famously saying that the middle class must be crushed between the two millstones of inflation and taxation, which is a situation that the entire West is in at the moment.
I was about to say, sounds familiar.
Yes, it does sound familiar. Yes, yes. Everything old is new again.
It's one of the reasons why communists love fiat currency and Keynesianism.
Well, yes. Well, plus as well, the ability of the government to print money allows them to pursue social projects that sort of give them a purpose for being, apart from just being effectively an administrator. This is part of the thing I'm doing on inflation and central banking, which is going to be a monster episode. I'm banging it together at the moment.
I'm looking forward to that one. It's going to be a fun one.
Luke's, of course, was a Marxist, or is. I'm not sure if he's dead. Almost everyone you study in modern university politics is Marxist. They just don't tell you that. Anyone who is explicitly
your internet stuttered. Can you back up to Luke's?
Sure.
Okay.
Luke's, of course, is a Marxist. Almost everyone you study in modern university politics is a Marxist. They just don't tell you that. Anyone who is explicitly anti-Marxist is branded as a fascist, for example, Pareto and Mosca, or a Nazi in the case of Schmidt. The teachers make it seem that although Marx may have gotten a few things wrong, he was fundamentally correct, and the argument is about how to apply Marx in any given circumstance, not whether he should be regarded at all, and certainly not about whether he should be banished from university for leading to the deaths of all those millions of people. When faced with how to gain political power in the United States, the Marxists were dismayed that Americans did not seem to want Marxism, and thus set out on a massive program of subversive analysis to discover what it was that was preventing America from embracing the obvious good of Marxism. Michel Foucault took this idea further with the fourth face of power, something that you will be very familiar with in modern day. The idea of a complex system of social relations, language, and social norms that prevented the emergence of Marxism, which was again simply a regurgitation of the ideas of Gramsci, that it was the pillars of a functioning society, education, law, religion, that prevented the emergence of socialism. The fourth face of power is more interested in the structural relationship between A and B. To quote Foucault, power is tolerable only on condition that it masks a substantial part of itself. Its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms. This is Foucault, 1976, quoted in Luke's 2005. So you can see that as the evolution of the secret ruling class begins to percolate through the West, keen-eyed observers begin sort of trying to understand this phenomena. Foucault, of course,
we noticers.
Yes, we noticers. Yes, Foucault, of course, was very into the idea that a sort of form of social constructivism, that it is only really the government that makes things so. His famous book, of course, Discipline and Punish, was all about how a criminal is only a criminal once the court deems him to be a criminal. And it is this kind of thinking, always using, of course, edge cases in order to widen the cracks in any kind of thought regime and undermine it, that leads to the state that we are in now, where you have trans women, for example, stating that they are women because it says on their passport that they are women. It says on their birth certificate. The idea that it is the state essentially that makes reality. And this echoes Gramsci's view of cultural hegemony. So from Gramsci's view, the stuff that stopped communism from emerging, that resisted the revolution, were the clergy, religion, education, public and private schools, the family, the patriarchal family specifically, the legal system, the police, courts, and jails, political parties, company unions, mass communication, print, radio, television, internet, and cinema, and the cultural sort of blob: literature, the arts, sports, etc. Now, you can see this is one of the reasons why the Marxists have attacked with gusto and undermined specifically all of these pillars of modern society, because they believe that it is the existence of these pillars that gives the state or society or the systemic milieu. Foucault is very, very much about this, about discourse and the speech relations between A and B and the expectations of culture. It's like the whole white supremacy thing that we see people banging on about. It's just there. It's out there. It's not any one person, right? And I believe that this is essentially a cope that people have in order to get around the fact that there is a secret power. But being secret, of course, it is undiscoverable. So people instead sort of throw out to this idea that there is no center fundamentally. And Gramsci comes to the idea that, well, there are multiple centers that must all be taken over. Following the iron law of leftist projection, it is easy to see how the left, using this theory of power, has structured society in the exact way that they ascribe to their opponents. They use all of these tricks and are then surprised when they do not work. They use brute force. They use agenda settings. They use the confusing of interests. They use the trick of trying to smuggle woke messaging into culture, thinking that people will not notice. And finally, of course, they engage in the corruption of language and social norms because they genuinely believe that all of society is simply a social construction. When these tactics do not work, instead of re-examining their framework, they merely claim that whatever they have done is not being done enough and then double down. They are convinced that everyone would want communism if only they had not been conditioned not to, generally by the family, which is why the family is oppressive, that nation states are artificial constructions of language and power. There is no such thing as justice, merely the words of law. There is no God, no truth, no beauty apart from that which is dictated by power. So, that's why the Marxists...
They only want there to be their false logos. They want to annihilate the logos of the ethnos. That's
correct.
What they want.
This is why they rule in the highly unhinged way that they do. They are simply following the rules of power as taught to them by their university professors and thinkers such as Marx and Gramsci and Lukes. It is really that simple. Woke, in fact, may be the fifth face of power, which is the ideas of Foucault, discourse, language, etc., except deliberately engineered to exclude the opposition, which is what Foucault claimed was happening to the communists, but instead directed by the communists as revenge for the imagined slight of having a functional society. The banning of words, the corruption of ideas, the undermining of all ethical assumptions in order to keep, quote, fascists, i.e. anyone who opposes Bolshevism, out of politics, except top-down and meticulously directed, instead of evolved over centuries the way that Gramsci's concept of hegemony was. After all, from the Foucauldian perspective, if you wish to overturn such a pervasive and subtle order, we would call this now by the woke term systemic, you would need to subvert all language, all concepts, all discourses, all power relations, which is exactly what the woke aims to do. So, now
and I'd like to point out, when he says the woke, he's talking about what I call anti-whiteism or the anti-white narrative, or anti-whites in power. People who are explicitly seeking the harm, enslavement, and destruction of our people and our civilization. It's basically just pick your right-wing pronoun, but I like to frame it in a lens of folk and our people. So that's why I call it those things.
Yes, but as I have said before, this is a toolkit that can be used against anyone. It just happens to be aimed at whites at the moment. If you go back through history, it's been aimed at many.
Yeah, so my choices are specifically for narrative warfare. not
yes.
To say that Chris is wrong, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, that's right. So, conclusion. A few words about power generally. Power cannot admit to a mistake because to do so erodes legitimacy. The admission of a mistake opens power up to accusations that someone else could do a better job. Excuse me. These claims are hard to resist in a new claimant, since they have no track record, whereas power does have one. Of course, power does make mistakes, sometimes very grave ones. And there sometimes comes a point where power must admit a mistake, since to keep denying does more harm to their legitimacy than admitting it. In this case, power will pivot to a scapegoat and say that the mistake was caused by one person or one party who betrayed the political formula upon which power is based. A new actor will come in, reaffirm the formula upon which power is based, and begin to rule with a new track record unblemished by the past. In practice, due to the short memory of people, this is about 15 to 20 years. Under no circumstances must the actual formula itself ever be admitted to have made a mistake. For if this happens, it threatens to undermine the formula and thus undermine all power. So, for example, if we look at the political formula that keeps the modern West afloat, for example, it is both sort of the idea of democracy and the idea of sort of expert technocracy, the idea that the people make the best decisions as long as they are managed, and that the experts know what they are doing. If any of these two things were fatally undermined, there would be no legitimacy for the rulers left, and other formulas could come in and potentially take over. This is the root cause of what is known as a limited hangout. Many people think of this as an intelligence term, but really it is a standard procedure for admitting mistakes while preserving the political formula that made that mistake. For example, look at COVID. It is now clear that the entire thing was a colossal mistake, or deliberately done, driven by pernicious interests. Power cannot say that COVID was caused by a reliance on experts, a too rigid admission of the ruling technocratic class, or massive corruption, since this is one of the fundamental planks or formulas upon which power rests. Instead, once another ruling party is in power, the mistakes will be blamed upon the previous regime. There will be some window dressing, demolishing of certain figures or companies, then possibly a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that will agonize about how the principles of the political formula that is technocratic democracy were violated by unscrupulous actors. They will talk about how bad actors exploited the system and went against its morals, but they will never address the question of whether the system itself enabled or abetted those actions in the first place, since that would open up ground for others who wish to see a different political formula rule.
Mhm.
This is one of the first rules of power. Never, ever let those who espouse a different political formula get anywhere near the levers of power. And I believe this is one of the reasons why we are seeing a lot of repression in the West, because the formula that is currently ruling is growing weaker and weaker by the day. And thus, those that have power are very, very keen to make sure that no one with any alternative political formulas becomes anywhere near the actual levers of power. Now, to do this is easy in a dictatorship. You simply declare those who do not share your formula the enemy, and you repress them. You are honest that you hate them, and their formula is an anathema. You can pull out reasons why to justify this position, but fundamentally you say, we are this formula, you are not, therefore you are our enemy. So the fascists, for example, or the National Socialists were very much like this. This is much easier to justify in times of chaos, or immediately after chaos, where the populace can see that an opposing formula has had disastrous consequences. This trick is much harder to pull off in regimes that rely upon the lie of, quote, popular legitimacy. Regimes that rely upon popular legitimacy, such as modern democracies, do have advantages. The population is generally more quiescent. Every 4 or 5 years, they go to the voting box and they believe they have an effect on the way the country is run. And to a certain extent, they do. They get to decide whether the blue flavor or the red flavor of political formula will rule them. But they do not get to decide upon the formula itself and on certain critical questions, such as central banking or more recently, mass immigration.
They decide between Orange Man or Purple Man.
Correct. Or mass immigration, which is a downstream effect of inflation, for example. These are never put on the ballot. This gives legitimacy, the illusion that the people are being listened to, because they are, but only on issues that will not fundamentally change anything. And the policy can always be blamed for the way society is. After all, you voted for it. And if you didn't vote for it, you're just going to have to accept it. After all, over 50% of people voted for it, and that's how democracy works. Don't you know? However, such regimes must walk a fine line between pretending that people could theoretically vote for whatever they want, and the truth that the range of possible political opinions is actually very narrow. This is why the ruling ideology is always framed as the center, and anything else is framed as extremism. This speaks to Luke's second face of power, agenda setting. This is a way of giving the false appearance of choice by controlling what choices can be made. The way it was explained to me was as a parent saying to a child, "Do you want carrots or broccoli?" Of course, the child wants neither. But by offering them a choice, you make them feel as though they are included in the decision when in fact they are not. This is why gatekeeping is so important in democratic societies and why the cries have grown ever more shrill around figures like Trump, Galloway, and anyone on the far right, for example. The choice is meant to be illusory, something that has become very clear recently with mass immigration, with choice always being, do you want more mass immigration or slightly less mass immigration? The choice of whether you want none is, of course, not allowed. Right.
That's
That's it.
beautifully said. Like
Oh, thank you
I
very much.
really enjoyed this presentation because this gets to the heart of the problems that I've had and why I became a dissident. Is in the aughts, I started to realize that this whole thing was just a fake and gay circus. That it didn't matter who I voted for, there was going to be war in Iraq. It didn't matter what I said, that the bombing of people around the world would continue and the color revolutions wouldn't stop. It didn't matter who I voted for locally or federally, the mass migration would continue and the Keynesian nightmare hell train would keep rolling. Like I started to realize this in my 20s, but I really didn't grasp it all till my 30s. And it's speaking of things that I didn't grasp until I was older. I will be sharing something tonight that is heavy, but I'm going to put a positive spin on it. And what I'm going to be sharing is something old, like Chris shared, Solzhenitsyn. I'm going to be sharing something with you from As Breathing and Consciousness Return. This is from the late 60s and early 70s. It was addended with a postscript in 1973, and I think was originally written in 1969, short on the heels, during the middle of the American Civil Rights and Cultural Revolution. There's that word again. Now, Chris, before I do this, is there anything that you would like to wrap up or say about your presentation before I move to my part?
I just wanted to reiterate again, sort of the point that one of the reasons why we are in the current situation is that the hidden power has now become too large to ignore. It is one of the sort of attributes of hidden power that, like a parasite, being hidden, it is unable to be controlled. And since it is unable to be controlled, it grabs all of the resources that it possibly can until it reaches a size where it literally cannot be ignored any longer. I mean, back in the 50s, it was one thing to say, oh, there hadn't been all the color revolutions. But now, unless you really are brain damaged and insist that color revolutions just happen by themselves, there is no ignoring the hidden power. And this makes for a very interesting moment because the hidden power, sort of by definition, is used to ruling from the shadows. It is used to having a sort of front of popular legitimacy that it can then manipulate. And as soon as a large segment of the population realizes that they are not being, in fact, ruled by the powers that they are claimed to be ruled, the powers over which they have decision-making power, all kinds of crazy things starts to happen. And the real question sort of in the future is what is going to happen to the hidden power, to the deep state? It looks like there are now enough people demanding the accountable parts of government take on the unaccountable parts. But I don't think that is a reasonable ask, because the unaccountable parts, the deep statey parts, have been around for over 100 years at this point. They never have to face elections. They do not have funding issues. They do not have constituents they need to please, unlike the legitimate government. So it's going to be interesting, right? Should we embiggen for your reading?
Let's please embiggen.
Embiggen?
There we go. Now, I'd like to remind you that after this, we will be moving to paid chats. So I'm going to put up the reminder banner. If you would please show your appreciation for what we do in the form of money, that would be great. This is what we both do for a living now. And Chris and I split all of the proceeds from this stream 50-50. So anything that comes in, I'll be sharing with him. Now, today, Chris talked about the real power that stays hidden. He talks about why they need us to have a false logos, a false god. Now, if anyone knows anything about living under the shadow of a false god, it would be an intelligent man who lived through Stalinist Russia. Now, I'm going to read you now just a little bit, it's not going to be too long, from As Breathing and Consciousness Return. Now, Alex, you said something earlier in the chat that ties in directly to what I'm about to read. So I'm going to read just a couple pages of this, and then I'm going to wrap up. Can external freedom for its own sake be the goal of conscious living beings? Or is it only a framework within which other and higher aims can be realized? We are creatures born with inner freedom of will, freedom of choice. The most important part of freedom is a gift to us at birth. External or social freedom is very desirable for the sake of undistorted growth, but it is no more than a condition, a medium, and to regard it as the object of our existence, nonsense. We can firmly assert our inner freedom even in external conditions of unfreedom. Remember how Dostoevsky, I can't say Russian words very well, Dostoevsky, I can't say these words well, forgive me, ridicules the complaint that our government has destroyed us. In an unfree environment, we do not lose the possibility of progress towards moral goals. That, for instance, of leaving this earth better men than our hereditary endowment has made us. The need to struggle against our surroundings rewards our efforts with greater inner success. There is, therefore, a miscalculation in the urgent pursuit of political freedom as the first and main thing. We should first have a clear idea of what to do with it, meaning this freedom. We were given this sort of freedom in 1917. And what did it mean to us? That every man was free to ride off with a rifle, whether he was fit for it or not, and to cut down telegraph wires for his own needs? The multi-party parliamentary system, which some among us consider the only true embodiment of freedom, has already existed for centuries in some Western European countries. But its dangerous, perhaps mortal defects have become more and more obvious in recent decades, when superpowers are rocked by party struggles with no ethical basis, when a tiny party can hold the balance between two big ones, and over an extended period determine the fate of its own ever-neighboring peoples, when unlimited freedom of discussion can wreck a country's resistance to some looming danger and lead to capitulation in wars not yet lost. When the historical democracies prove impotent, faced with a handful of sniveling terrorists. The Western democracies today are in a state of political crisis and spiritual confusion. This was written 55 years ago. Let that sink in.
By Solzhenitsyn.
I'm going to read that again and we're going to continue. The Western democracies today are in a state of political crisis and spiritual confusion. Today, more than at any time in the past, it ill becomes us to see our country's only way out in the Western parliamentary system, especially since Russia's readiness for such a system, which was very doubtful in 1917, can only have declined still further in the half-century since. Let us note that in the long history of mankind, there have not been so very many democratic republics, yet people lived for centuries without them and were not always worse off. They even experienced, quote, happiness we are forever hearing about, which was sometimes called pastoral or patriarchal, and is not a mere literary invention. They preserved the physical health of the nation. Obviously they did, or we wouldn't be here. They preserved its moral health too, which has left its imprint at least on folklore and proverbs, a level of moral health incomparably higher than that expressed to us today in simian radio music, pop songs, and insulting advertisements. Could a listener from outer space imagine that our planet had already known and left behind Bach, Rembrandt, and Dante? Many of these state systems were authoritarian, that is to say, based on subordination to forms of authority varying in origin and quality. We understand the term in the broadest possible way today, taking in everything from power based on unquestionable authority to authority based on unquestionable power, which is what we live under now. Russia too existed for many centuries under various forms of rule. Russia too preserved itself and its health and did not experience episodes of self-destruction like those of the 20th century. And for 10 centuries, millions of our peasant forebears died feeling that their lives had not been unbearable. If such systems have functioned for centuries on end in many states, are we not entitled to believe that, provided certain limits are not exceeded, they too can offer a people a tolerable life, as much as any democratic republic? Together with their virtues of stability, continuity, immunity from political argue, there are, needless to say, great dangers and defects in authoritarian systems of government. The danger of dishonest authorities, upheld by violence, the danger of arbitrary decisions and the difficulty of correcting them, the danger of sliding into tyranny. But authoritarian regimes, as such, are not frightening. Only those which are answerable to no one and nothing. I would like you to remember now what Chris said earlier, how this cannot be questioned. Any real resistance to this entire framework never enters the discourse. The autocrats of earlier religious ages, though their power was ostensibly unlimited, felt themselves responsible before God and their own conscience. The autocrats of our own time are dangerous because it is difficult to find higher values which could bind them. It would be more correct to say that in relation to the true ends of human beings here on earth, and these cannot be equated with the aims of the animal world, which amount to no more than unhindered existence, the state structure is of secondary significance. That is to say, Christ himself teaches us, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, not because every Caesar deserves it, but because Caesar's concern is not with the most important thing in our lives. If Russia for centuries was used to living under autocratic systems and suffered total collapse under the democratic system, which lasted only 8 months in 1917, perhaps, I am only asking, not making an assertion, perhaps we should recognize that the evolution of our country from one form of authoritarianism to another would be the most natural, the smoothest, and the least painful path of development for it to follow. It may be objected that neither the path ahead, nor still less the new system at the end of it, could be seen. But for that matter, we have never been shown any realistic path of transition from our present system to a democratic republic of the Western type. And the first mentioned transition seems more feasible in that it requires a smaller expender of energy by the people. The state system which exists in our country is terrible not because it is undemocratic, authoritarian, or based on physical constraint. A man can live in such conditions without harm to his spiritual essence. Our present system, now Alex, this is for you. I told you that this is how I was going to wrap up my segment. The state system which exists in our country is terrible not because it is undemocratic or authoritarian. A man can live in such conditions without harm to his spiritual essence. Our present system is unique in world history because over and above its physical and economic constraints, it demands us to totally surrender our souls, continuous and active participation in the general conscious lie, the empire of lies. To this putrefaction of the soul, this spiritual enslavement, human beings who wish to be human cannot consent. This is the division that Chris and I are getting at in this episode. When Caesar, having exacted what is Caesar's, demands still more, insistently that we render unto him what is God's, that is a sacrifice that we dare not and cannot make. The most important part of our freedom, our inner freedom, is always subject to our will, if we surrender it to corruption, we do not deserve to be called human. But let us note that if the absolutely essential task is not political liberation, but the liberation of our souls from participation in this lie forced upon us, then it requires no physical, revolutionary, social, or organizational measures, no meetings, no terrorism, no strikes of the trade unions, things fearful for us to contemplate and from which we quite naturally allow circumstances to dissuade us. No, it requires from each individual a moral step within his own power, and no more than that. And no one who voluntarily runs with the hounds of falsehood or props it up will ever be able to justify to the living or to the posterity or his friends or to God that he did the right thing. Now, I want to end this on a white pill. Now, that was some heavy stuff I just read. But I want you to realize this was 55 years ago that he wrote that as an assessment of what was going on in America and what was going on in Russia. We are there today, and we are in a better place. We have interconnected internet communication. We have thousands and thousands of motivated, dissident-minded people raising thousands and thousands of children with what I just read from this book in their minds. That we will not be their slaves. They cannot own our souls. We will build something better. We will have logos and ethnos again. And that's the white pill I want to end on, is there have been people, brilliant people, like this man Solzhenitsyn, who understood and saw these problems, but they felt futile and impotent to do much about it. We're not like that today. I know that people get blackpilled and they think, oh, there's nothing I can do against the regime. That's not true. The regime seems really powerful and ever-present. That's because it's struggling to keep control. It's weakening. Yes, it's dangerous, but it's weakening. It's decaying. And if we hold true, and this is why I always say keep heart, we cannot let that flame in us go out. That's our choice. We have to be the light to lead the way for our people. And I'm going to leave it there.
Can I just point out that, as in all asymmetrical forms of conflict, all we really have to do is endure, actually. Like just by surviving, just by not sacrificing souls is a victory. Because from the totalitarian point of view, everyone must accept the totalizing system. And as long as there is one person out there who does not accept it, victory has not been attained.
I'm just responding to a chat here real quick. Someone asked about the picnic. We'll talk about that Monday. So I think that that's a good positive place for me to end on. I don't have any wrap up. That's what I had prepared for you tonight. That was my both old and new take on the topic tonight. And even though heavy and dark-minded and kind of hopeless, Solzhenitsyn gets it. He understands where we are at spiritually and culturally. He got it. And I am inspired by what I read from him. And I don't see looming darkness and hopelessness. I see this great evil machine, this evil soulless empire. I see it weakening, and I see us becoming stronger to do something about it every day. So, Chris, I have nothing else to say. I have finished, and I think that we both did well. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing before we move to paid chats?
Not really. That was a lovely reading from Solzhenitsyn. I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you. Yeah, just
and I seem to have gauged the time just right, because we're just now coming up on the hour mark. We did good.
you might. I think there's a bunch of links to these papers in the in the description if you want to read them. But just have a think to yourself, right? Like what is power precisely? You would think it's a very, very simple thing to delineate, but actually coming up with a concise definition can be tricky. And just, again, think of the woke and the way that they define power as rather as like a transaction between A and B, as this whole superstructure, that sort of like, holds everything together through the words that you use and the things that you think and the prejudices that you have. And that's why they're so insane, because in their attempt to rule in such a way, they cannot just be like, oh, well, we are going to make, person A do the thing that person B wants. They must alter every single word, every piece of the past, every thought, every action. And that's why they lose, because it is an impossible task to do such a thing. They bite off way more than they can chew. Their explanatory sort of mechanisms become total and thus highly unwieldy. They cannot abide the exception. All totalitarian systems are like this. If there's just one thing that's out of place, they're like, oh my God, the system doesn't explain everything. Yeah, that's what systems are like. They don't explain everything, and since the left are always so good at being like, oh, well, sure, you have men and women, but what about this one person who doesn't fall into either category? The system is incomplete, therefore we must tear everything down and do it again. Well, they do this to their own systems, of course, because you can always find an edge case. You can always find an exception. So, that's one of the reasons why the left is always eating itself and eating its children in a sort of epochal act of autophagy. It can't last, bros. So, yes.
The Ouroboros. It will consume itself. Well, we have a few things to get to. We will start with the one that came in first at the beginning of the stream from our good sister, E. Essington. Thank you, as always, for your financial support, sister. It means so much to me. For $10 US, she says, greetings to Yiz, Newsfist, and the chat. The daffodils and forsythia are in bloom here in the heartlands of the USA. Don't forget to spring ahead on Saturday night if you are a daylight savings time person. Yes, this weekend we will be springing forward, so to speak, and losing an hour of our Sunday. So those of you who live in places where they honor daylight savings time, or in my opinion, are forced to use daylight savings time because I don't like it, remember to change your clocks this Saturday night. Now, thank you, E. Essington. Over on Entropy, we have from Arakeen Green Moon again. Good to see you in the chat, friend. Arakeen Green Moon for $5 US says, if power is hidden, then you would run into the issue of culture. The leader's way of behaving, how they talk and dress sort of trickles down. But if it's hidden, then values become diffuse and hidden. Is that why with Trump is one to emulate? Is that why with Trump is one to emulate? That's I think. Go ahead, Chris. I'll let you.
So
take this one.
yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point. So you cannot really hide power, right? Everyone recognizes a powerful individual. I mean, just look at money, right? Money is one of the surest measures of power. So, everyone recognizes someone who is extremely wealthy by, the material goods they have. So actually, as always, the mores and the culture of the ruling elite begin to, infect wider society. This is one of the problems, for example, with massive inflation and central bank money printing, is that those who have the power, they do whatever they want. By doing whatever they want, other people see them doing whatever they want. And then they're like, oh, well, this must be the way to power, to be venal, to, be Machiavellian, to, take whatever you want. But they don't realize that there was a sort of hidden mechanism to get them to this place. And thus, as this culture sort of begins to spread throughout society, the entire moral fabric begins to come apart, because people mistakenly believe, or perhaps correctly believe, that the way to power is to abandon religion, abandon all norms, abandon care and love for your fellow man, and simply seek enrichment at all costs. It's not a new story. It's you can look in the Bible for
and
good examples.
One simple thing I would say is perhaps in the past that might have mattered, but today it doesn't. Because the people who lord over us, they don't care about culture. They don't care if the people they lord over are like them at all. Remember, leaders in the past might have cared. They might have been French and cared about the French staying French. The leaders who rule us today want our race, our ethnicity, our beliefs, and our traditions smashed and buried. They hate us and want us gone. They don't care if the mutt race that they create with mass immigration, the soulless, godless mutt race they create, looks like them at all. Because they only want slave-like farm animals that are only competent enough to keep making them money and hold up their evil empire. They don't care if we look like them or talk like them or dress like them. They have no interest in that at all. That would be my answer to that.
Well, they say that, but I think the consequences of such a policy is beginning to bite them on the ass, and they have suddenly realized that if literally everyone is imported from Africa, there won't even be anyone who understands their high faulted theories, and there'll be no one they can belittle because no one will speak their language. So I don't know. Also, we have someone's got a birthday in the chat, Lady Miss Coppertone. Happy birthday!
Oh, well, happy birthday, friend! Happy birthday. We have 2 more things to get to on Cash App. Jason Kuna, the No White Guilt guy, is with us tonight. Thank you so much for your financial donation, brother. It means so much. For $6 US, he says, very well said, Yiz. Kip, great show. Well, thank you, brother. I appreciate that.
Thanks very much, Jason.
We also have Cool Papa J Magic, longtime viewer and friend of the channel. He sends in $10 US. Thank you so much, brother. He says, for enjoying this series so much, and he gives a little 07. Well, 07 back to you, brother. I deeply appreciate the financial support. Thank you.
Thanks very much, mate.
And that is all that I see right now. I'm going to refresh them to make sure I didn't miss anybody. Okay, nothing new there. Let me check PayPal because it's stuttering. PayPal, please stop stuttering. I don't know why. PayPal is really chunky on the website. I don't know why. Why is it taking so long? Oh, I'm glad I waded through it because we have something from Dawn. Dawn in chat. Hello, Dawn. Heart for you, sister. Good to see you. She just says thank you, and she sends $10 to us for the work. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that, sister. Thank you so much. All right, then. I believe that is everything. 10, 10, 5. Yeah, that's all 5. So that was 5, 1, and a 2, 3, and then 2 on Cash App, and I don't see any others. Okay, so there was one thing at the end that I wanted to share, and it's something beautiful that Sister Holly from up in Canada sent to us. In response to what I shared and that meaningful stuff that we had there at the end, she said this in Rumble chat, and she didn't send in money for it, but it's touching, and I want to read it. She says, my whole life, this has been a quiet rumbling, a white noise in the background. Today there is a louder and easier to hear screaming, still off in the hills, but it's there. The internet has been an incredibly powerful tool for both sides. Bill C-63 up here is the desperate attempt to silence it, but there is a will. But where there's a will, there is a way. Yes, exactly. We have tools, connection, and power that the enemy doesn't have. This evil, hollow regime lacks truth. There's no truth to it. There's no God to it. There's no logos. There's nothing real to it other than its power. And it will fade, and we will win. So that's it for tonight.
The internet is actually sort of conversely one of their greatest strengths, but also their greatest weaknesses, because they cannot possibly shut it down because everything runs on it now. And, you know, hackers being what they are, you know, there'll always be one step ahead, a way to get the word out. So, you know, thanks for listening, guys. We really, really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the show.
Yeah, it was a really good, touching show, and I'm glad that all that we prepared came out great, and I hope it landed with you guys. I hope that it both inspired and educated you a little bit. That's the whole purpose of this stream, is to give you guys constructive ideas, good language, and inspiration. Most importantly, to not give up. That's what they want. That's the only thing that they can't force you to do, is to give up. You have to do that on your own, and well, we're going to prevent that the best we can. So we will see you guys Monday night for Discordant Dragons, Monday for the Habiting on Chris's channel, 3 hours before Discordant Dragons. I love you all, and I will see you Monday night. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks very much, guys. See you later.
God bless.
God bless.